December 3rd, 1951, smoke curled toward the ceiling of a concrete-walled briefing room deep inside a Soviet intelligence complex outside Moscow. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco and damp wool coats. A group of GRU analysts sat around a long metal table, studying a stack of grainy reconnaissance photos that had arrived only hours earlier. At the center of the images was the same aircraft appearing again and again, a Chinese-operated Tu-2 bomber, its wings heavy with ordnance, its profile instantly recognizable to anyone who had fought in the last war. A colonel with a scar running across his jaw tapped the photograph with a wooden pointer. He had spent half his life around metal and engines, and carried himself like a man who believed in simple machines over complicated ideas. When he spoke, his voice held that familiar tone of Soviet certainty. "American fighters will never catch it," he said. "Not at night, not at low altitude. Their radar is too weak, their interceptors too slow." A few officers laughed quietly. A general leaned back in his chair, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke toward the flickering projector. "The Tu-2 was built to outrun trouble," he said. "It slipped past German fighters for years, and now it flies even lower for the Chinese. The Americans won't even know it's there." This was the comfortable logic that guided Soviet assessments. The Tu-2 wasn't new, but it was dependable, fast in a straight line, rugged, able to skim along valleys and coastlines where radar beams struggled to track it. When flown by crews trained in low-level night raids, it became a ghost. To the analysts in that room, it was simply obvious. The Chinese had chosen the perfect tool for nighttime strikes across the Korean front. Another officer flipped through the documents, shaking his head at an American report claiming new night intercept capabilities. "Propaganda," he muttered. "They want us to believe they can see in the dark." No one challenged the idea. The Soviet doctrine of the era treated simplicity as truth. If a machine worked reliably yesterday, it would work reliably tomorrow. And if the Americans claimed something beyond that, some new radar trick, some new interception method, it was dismissed as hollow bragging. But beneath the easy confidence, a single line in the incoming report went unnoticed. A line about a strange radar return near Busan. A line about an American interceptor that had taken off from Okinawa under unusual orders. If anyone in that room had realized what that meant, the laughter would have stopped instantly. Because within hours, one Chinese Tu-2 would not be a ghost. It would be a fireball falling from the night sky, and the Soviet officers in that room would be forced to rewrite everything they believed about American air power. To the Soviet analysts in that smoke-filled room, the Tu-2 was not merely a bomber but a proven machine forged through years of brutal war, refined by experience, and trusted by crews who knew exactly how to coax speed and stability from its rugged frame. They viewed it as the textbook example of reliable Soviet engineering. A twin-engine aircraft capable of hauling heavy ordnance at a respectable 330 miles per hour, while still maintaining the agility to weave through mountain valleys where American radar beams scattered and lost strength. The men studying its silhouette believed it embodied everything. Their doctrine valued simplicity, durability, and the kind of mechanical honesty that didn't fail under pressure or demand exotic maintenance rituals in the middle of a campaign. From their perspective, handing the Tu-2 to Chinese crews had been a strategic masterstroke, because these pilots operated with a level of discipline that mirrored Soviet wartime philosophy, flying low enough to touch the treetops and cutting their engines short to evade detection from American listening posts. The combination of Soviet machinery and Chinese night raiding tactics produced what the analysts considered an almost unbeatable threat, a blend of speed and stealth that seemed perfectly matched to the rugged geography of the Korean peninsula. They admired how the bomber could slip along the edges of mountain ridges, using the terrain itself as camouflage, while American radar operators sat staring at empty scopes, convinced no aircraft could possibly be maneuvering through such narrow corridors. The GRU colonel who dismissed American capabilities earlier reinforced this belief with quiet authority, reminding the room that the Tu-2 had survived against far deadlier opponents than anything the United States currently fielded in theater. He spoke of its performance on the Eastern Front, where it had outrun German fighters, shrugged off flak bursts, and returned home with damage that would have grounded more fragile Western aircraft, all of which strengthened the idea that the bomber was nearly untouchable when flown correctly. He argued that the Americans relied too heavily on complicated systems that faltered under battlefield conditions, whereas the Tu-2 thrived precisely because it offered no unnecessary complexity for pilots to battle against in the dark. Another analyst noted proudly that the bomber's wood and metal construction absorbed radar waves in unpredictable ways, giving it a natural advantage during low-altitude approaches that made it frustratingly hard to track, even with improved Allied sets developed after the Second World War. This observation sparked a round of confident nods, because it aligned perfectly with their worldview. Soviet engineering created machines that excelled in real combat, while American solutions seemed to rely on theoretical advantages that evaporated once the shooting started. By the time the discussion wound down, an unspoken consensus had settled over the table, forming a quiet but absolute conviction that no American fighter could reliably intercept a Tu-2 operating at night. They believed the United States lacked the radar precision, the reaction time, and the tactical flexibility to stop even a single low-flying bomber, let alone disrupt the broader pattern of Chinese night raids. It was a conclusion reinforced by years of doctrine, thousands of pages of analysis, and the lingering pride of a nation that had survived the most devastating war in human history. Yet despite their certainty, the analysts failed to consider how quickly technology could leap when necessity sharpened American innovation, and none of them imagined that an interceptor designed in peacetime training halls could soon rewrite everything they assumed to be true. Their confidence persisted even as a lone F-94 Starfire climbed into the freezing night, closing the distance toward a shadow, cutting silently across the Korean skies, an encounter that would expose just how fragile their perfect weapon truly was. The confidence surrounding the Tu-2 inside the Soviet briefing room was strengthened even further by the belief that Chinese night raid doctrine represented an evolution of wartime tactics the Red Army had refined through years of attrition, creating a system of attack that exploited darkness, terrain, and human psychology in equal measure. Soviet strategists admired how the Chinese employed the bomber not as a blunt instrument, but as a surgical blade, sending it into the Korean night at altitudes where moonlight barely touched the wings, allowing the aircraft to slip past American perimeter defenses with an almost ghost-like quality. They viewed these missions as part of a broader operational philosophy in which speed and timing mattered more than brute force, because the aim was not to destroy entire airfields but to disrupt supply lines, shake troop morale, and remind American commanders that the skies were never fully in their control. Chinese crews flying the Tu-2 adhered to this doctrine with impressive discipline, cutting radio chatter to absolute silence, and navigating using terrain shadows they had memorized from repeated sorties, all while maintaining a low-altitude profile that made traditional interception methods nearly impossible. Soviet advisors embedded with Chinese units sent back reports praising their precision, describing how pilots threaded narrow valleys at night with a calm confidence that suggested they possessed a sixth sense for the land beneath them. These accounts painted a picture of a force uniquely capable of exploiting every weakness in the American defensive network, making the Tu-2 appear not just effective, but perfectly matched to the demands of nocturnal warfare. The doctrine's power rested on one foundational belief. If the bomber could avoid early detection, then the Americans would be forced to react rather than preempt, placing them perpetually behind the tempo of the raid. Soviet commanders had learned during the Great Patriotic War that forcing the enemy into a reactive posture created psychological strain that accumulated over time, weakening their decision-making and eroding their confidence in their own equipment. The Chinese strategy applied this lesson flawlessly, creating a rhythm of nightly intrusions that kept American personnel exhausted and uncertain, unsure whether the next radar return would be a false echo or the beginning of another low-flying strike. At the strategic level, Soviet planners saw these operations as a quiet demonstration of combined doctrine, a partnership where Chinese courage and familiarity with the terrain amplified the advantages of Soviet engineering, while the political circumstances of the Korean conflict allowed both nations to test their theories without committing their full militaries. The Tu-2 became the symbol of this shared approach, a machine that bridged ideology and necessity, proving that a well-executed doctrine could compensate for limitations in numbers or technology. It seemed to them the perfect embodiment of asymmetric pressure, forcing the Americans to fight a type of air war they were not prepared to confront at scale. Yet beneath the admiration and theoretical certainty lay a blind spot that none of the analysts cared to examine too closely, because they assumed that the Americans were still relying on outdated interception techniques inherited from the last war. They believed the United States lacked both the hardware and the tactical imagination to counter a bomber weaving through the valleys under cover of darkness, and therefore dismissed every report hinting at new radar behaviors or unusual scramble orders as coincidence rather than evidence. Their doctrine felt airtight, their assumptions felt unshakable, and their perfect weapons seemed poised to exploit the gaps they believed defined American capability. But as the night deepened over the Korean peninsula, the Chinese crews preparing their Tu-2 seconds did not realize that one American squadron had already begun to adapt, and a single interceptor climbing through the clouds was about to challenge the entire doctrine the Soviets considered untouchable. Within the Soviet assessment community, the belief that American air power lacked the necessary tools to counter nighttime intrusions solidified into something approaching doctrine, because every evaluation they conducted reinforced the idea that the United States possessed impressive daylight fighters, but struggled enormously once the sun dipped below the horizon. They viewed the F-86 Sabre as a remarkable aircraft during daytime engagements, capable of dueling MiG-15 seconds and holding its own against fast jet opponents, yet fundamentally crippled by its limited radar suite and inability to operate effectively in the dense nighttime fog that often settled over Korean valleys. Analysts repeatedly emphasized that a fighter designed around visual engagement could not reliably hunt a bomber operating without lights, hugging mountainsides, and flying so low that even small variations in terrain could create momentary invisibility on American scopes. This conviction extended to the twin-engine B-26 Invader, which the Soviets acknowledged as a versatile attack aircraft, but dismissed as entirely inadequate for the rapid interception roles required to stop a fast, low-flying Tu-2 before it reached its target. They argued that the Invader lacked both the acceleration and the radar precision needed to identify a bomber threading through narrow valleys, especially when Chinese crews deliberately altered their approach routes to create unpredictable flight paths that American controllers would struggle to anticipate. By comparing the performance envelopes of these aircraft on paper, Soviet analysts convinced themselves that no American machine in active service could reliably close the distance soon enough to trigger a successful nighttime engagement. Their evaluation went beyond simple performance metrics. However, because they believed the Americans were still relying on outdated command and control procedures that forced pilots to navigate large swaths of terrain almost blindly during nocturnal operations. Reports from the front suggested that U.S. radar stations frequently battled cluttered screens filled with ground returns, weather interference, and echoes too faint to classify, creating a chaotic picture that required experienced operators to distinguish meaningful traces from background noise. Soviet officers interpreted this confusion as evidence that American detection systems were several years behind what would be required to track something as elusive as a Tu-2 flying mere hundreds of feet above the ground. In one animated discussion, a senior GRU major argued that the Americans simply lacked the conceptual framework needed to fight a modern nighttime interdiction campaign, asserting that their reliance on visual confirmation made them vulnerable to any aircraft willing to exploit the natural cover provided by the Korean peninsula's rugged geography. He reminded the room that even during the Second World War, the United States had struggled to conduct consistent night interceptions over Europe, whereas the Soviet Union had adapted quickly through necessity, producing pilots who learned to trust instruments, terrain familiarity, and carefully rehearsed attack patterns. This history shaped their confidence now, reinforcing the belief that the Americans remained fundamentally reactive rather than anticipatory when dealing with low-altitude threats. As the analysts reviewed additional field reports, they found nothing that contradicted their assumption, because every successful Chinese strike only validated their belief that the Tu-2 remained outside the effective reach of American interceptors. They convinced themselves that the United States had no aircraft capable of rapidly acquiring, closing on, and eliminating a moving target in near darkness, particularly one designed to exploit radar blind spots and fly through the narrow passages where clouds gathered thickest. In their minds, the gap between theory and reality was non-existent, and their confidence in the bomber's survivability approached something close to certainty. What none of them realized, however, was that the Americans had quietly begun testing a new generation of airborne radar systems that operated independently of ground stations, granting their fighters an unprecedented ability to search, track, and engage hostile aircraft without relying on outdated procedures. The Soviet analysts remained unaware that the technological problem they believed defined the entire conflict had already been challenged by engineers working in airfields far from the front lines, and that a single interceptor carrying this unfamiliar equipment was already climbing into the cold, still air above the Pacific. Their assessments remained confident, their tone remained dismissive, and their conclusions remained fixed right up until the moment the first Tu-2 disappeared from the night sky. While the Soviet analysts remained firmly convinced of their conclusions, American radar operators stationed across the Pacific were beginning to notice irregular patterns that suggested the enemy's confidence in low-altitude infiltration might be dangerously misplaced. In a dimly lit operations room on Okinawa, technicians monitoring long-range radar sweeps detected a faint, inconsistent trace creeping across the edge of their display, a signal so subtle that it initially appeared indistinguishable from the usual clutter generated by coastal terrain and shifting weather. Yet one senior operator, accustomed to sensing the difference between meaningless noise and genuine movement, paused long enough to mark the anomaly and escalate it to his commanding officer with a quiet certainty that something unusual had just crossed their detection envelope. The report was relayed through several channels before reaching the Regional Air Operations Center, where a small team of officers gathered around the plotting table to evaluate the potential threat posed by the unidentified contact. They quickly determined that the trace's speed, altitude, and direction matched previous intelligence estimates of Chinese Tu-2 flight behavior, suggesting that another night raid might be unfolding along a route previously considered too hazardous for American interceptors to attempt. Despite the lack of visual confirmation, the officers recognized that ignoring the warning could leave vulnerable supply convoys exposed to attack, particularly those transporting critical material toward frontline positions near Busan. One of the senior commanders, who had grown increasingly frustrated by repeated nighttime disruptions, decided that the situation demanded a response more assertive than the typical scramble orders issued during earlier raids. He believed the time had come to test the capabilities of the newly deployed F-94 Starfire, an interceptor equipped with an experimental airborne radar system rumored to have significantly better detection range than anything previously fielded in the theater. Although the aircraft had not yet been widely integrated into standard defensive operations, its unique features presented a rare opportunity to challenge a threat that had eluded the United States for far too long. The decision to scramble the F-94 carried its own risks, because the aircraft's advanced systems remained unfamiliar to many pilots, and nighttime operations over the turbulent waters west of Japan demanded exceptional precision and unwavering focus. Yet the commander reasoned that the chance to intercept a low-flying Tu-2 before it reached Korean airspace justified the gamble, particularly given the pressure mounting on American ground units struggling to maintain secure supply routes. He issued the order with a firm resolve, instructing the flight crew to prepare their aircraft immediately and coordinate with radar controllers to refine the target's projected flight path. As ground crews rushed to ready the interceptor, the pilot assigned to the mission received a rapid briefing that emphasized both the urgency of the situation and the unknowns surrounding the engagement. He studied the radar trace plotted across a map of the region, noting how the projected course aligned almost perfectly with previous attacks that had inflicted considerable damage on American installations. The implications were clear. If the Tu-2 managed to slip past their defenses again, enemy forces would continue exploiting the same weaknesses that had plagued their nighttime posture for months. With the briefing complete and the engines roaring to life, the pilot climbed into the cockpit, fully aware that he was about to test technology few in the theater had witnessed firsthand. He understood that this mission represented more than a routine scramble. It was a direct challenge to the belief that American forces lacked the necessary tools to confront seasoned Chinese crews, navigating the darkness with practiced confidence. As the F-94 lifted off the runway and angled toward the night sky, the radar operators who had first detected the faint signal watched anxiously, knowing that their intuition had set in motion an encounter that might redefine the boundaries of aerial warfare. They could only hope that the aircraft now climbing into the void carried the capability they believed it possessed, because the shadow moving steadily across the Pacific was no mere anomaly. It was the embodiment of a doctrine the Soviets considered unbreakable, and its path would soon intersect with the future of American interception strategy. The F-94 Starfire climbed steadily into the night, its twin engines leaving a faint shimmering trail against the cold December air, as the pilot adjusted his heading, according to the latest vector, relayed from the operations center. The darkness around him felt impossibly vast, an endless void broken only by the soft glow of instrument panels and the rhythmic pulse of radar sweeps echoing through the cockpit like a distant heartbeat. He knew that once he cleared the coastal haze, the safety of familiar lights would fall away behind him, leaving only the black ocean beneath and the uncertain promise of an enemy bomber somewhere ahead. As the aircraft leveled off at its assigned altitude, the pilot began tuning the APG-33 radar set with deliberate care, understanding that its sensitivity would determine whether the mission succeeded or ended as just another fruitless search over hostile waters. The system emitted a soft electronic hum, while the scope flickered with scattered traces that merged, separated, and dissolved into the shifting noise created by distant waves and atmospheric distortion. He scanned these shapes with trained patience, searching for the subtle consistency that differentiated an aircraft from the countless false echoes that frequently misled inexperienced operators. The flight profile demanded that he maintain a precise balance between speed and control, because pushing the Starfire too aggressively risked outrunning radar updates, while slowing too much would delay interception and allow the Tu-2 to slip deeper into Korean airspace. Ground controllers, monitoring the target from multiple stations, issued intermittent course corrections that guided him toward a narrowing corridor where the faint track had last appeared, warning him to expect turbulence created by winter winds, funneling between the Japanese islands and the edge of the Pacific front. The pilot acknowledged each transmission calmly, relying on the aircraft's powerful engines to keep his altitude stable as he entered a patch of dense cloud layered like wet wool across the sky. Inside the cockpit, visibility dropped to nothing as the Starfire plunged into the swirling gray mass, forcing the pilot to trust his instruments entirely, while the aircraft buffeted under sudden gusts that pushed against the wings with unpredictable force. He kept his grip steady, knowing that the Tu-2's preferred flight path often skirted the edges of storm formations to mask its approach, and that entering these clouds was both a tactical necessity and a calculated gamble. The radar readings sharpened slightly within the enclosed moisture, producing isolated blips that the pilot studied with cautious interest, though none displayed the consistency required to confirm a genuine contact. Below him, the ocean rolled in long, dark swells that reflected faint starlight whenever breaks appeared in the clouds, creating momentary glimpses of a world that felt eerily silent and impossibly empty. The pilot understood that this emptiness was deceptive, because somewhere within the layered shadows ahead, the Tu-2 was moving with deliberate purpose, guided by a crew practiced in navigating the narrow boundary between concealment and vulnerability. Each minute that passed tightened the invisible race unfolding across the sky, with the bomber steadily approaching its intended target and the interceptor closing the distance with growing urgency. The pilot adjusted his throttle slightly, allowing the aircraft to accelerate just enough to position himself ahead of the projected intercept line, creating an angle of approach that would force the Tu-2 into his radar cone, rather than requiring a difficult rear chase engagement. This maneuver demanded perfect timing, because overshooting the corridor would produce a blind zone where the bomber could slip past unnoticed, yet lagging behind would cede the advantage to an enemy crew accustomed to exploiting even the smallest delay. He exhaled slowly, steadying his focus as he scanned the radar scope once more, searching for the faintest sign that the enemy was nearing the range where the Starfire's systems could finally lock on. Then, for the briefest moment, a thin trace appeared along the upper right quadrant of the display, flickering like a distant ember before stabilizing into a shape that matched the profile he had been hunting. The pilot leaned forward as the return strengthened, understanding immediately that the encounter he had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. Somewhere beyond the clouded horizon, the Tu-2 was flying straight toward him, unaware that the night it trusted for protection had just betrayed it to an interceptor crafted for exactly this moment. The faint radar contact stabilized slowly, forming a thin, deliberate curve that separated itself from the surrounding noise, with the quiet certainty of something alive and moving with purpose through the night. The pilot watched the trace elongate across the scope, noting the steady speed that fell almost perfectly within the profile expected of a Tu-2 flown by an experienced Chinese crew executing a low-altitude ingress toward the Korean peninsula. Although the return was still faint, the consistency of its rhythm convinced him that he had finally found the target whose existence had eluded American interceptors for months, and a slow current of adrenaline began tightening through his chest as the reality of the encounter settled in. He adjusted the radar gain with practiced precision, easing the sensitivity upward until the display brightened slightly, revealing subtler edges around the returning signal that hinted at the bomber's banking motions as it navigated through heavy cloud. The contact's altitude reading fluctuated within a narrow band, suggesting the crew was maintaining their usual evasive pattern, flying just high enough to avoid catastrophic terrain impacts, yet low enough to remain hidden from ground-based detection. This behavior matched every intelligence report he had studied, reinforcing the idea that the enemy still believed themselves completely invisible in the darkness surrounding them. As he fine-tuned his intercept vector, the pilot radioed the operations center with a calm confirmation that the target had been acquired, though he requested no additional guidance to avoid cluttering the channel and risking delays in receiving essential radar updates. The ground controller acknowledged his transmission with a terse but encouraging reply, advising him to maintain his heading and prepare for a tightening overtake curve that would require absolute focus once the range closed to within a few miles. Their combined professionalism created a steady rhythm of discipline and expectation, forming a quiet partnership between the aircraft and the silent figures guiding it from far behind. The Starfire's engines vibrated under the strain of the pilot's slight acceleration, pushing the aircraft to a speed that would position him behind and slightly above the bomber's projected flight path, a placement designed to maximize radar lock stability while minimizing the risk of overshooting into the Tu-2's blind zone. He knew that catching the enemy here, in the narrow gap between storm layers, demanded a delicate balance between aggression and restraint, because climbing too steeply might cause radar scattering, while descending too abruptly could place him in dangerous proximity to terrain masked by darkness. Every movement of the throttle felt like a negotiation with unseen forces, each adjustment carrying consequences that rippled outward across the unfolding encounter. Gradually, the radar contact brightened, transitioning from a thin whisper of energy into a more deliberate shape that moved with unmistakable intent, revealing tiny variations in bearing that suggested the bomber's crew was adjusting for crosswinds, blowing in from the coastline. These details, subtle yet telling, confirmed beyond any doubt that he was tracking a real aircraft rather than a transient echo generated by atmospheric distortion. With every passing second, the range indicator ticked downward, bringing the Starfire closer to the moment when the radar system would transition from raw search mode to targeting parameters capable of providing a weapons solution. The pilot steadied his breathing as he scanned the surrounding darkness, knowing the Tu-2 might soon emerge from the shifting cloud banks as a faint silhouette outlined by moonlight slipping between the storm layers. He imagined the Chinese crew below, focused solely on their approach route, unaware that an interceptor equipped with technology they had never encountered was closing the distance with increasing confidence. In their minds, the night remained a shield, a familiar ally that had protected them countless times before, but the pilot understood that SHIELD was about to fail them in a way none of their Soviet advisors had ever predicted. When the radar indicator suddenly brightened with a sharp, clean return that pulsed in perfect synchrony with the Tu-2's movement, the pilot recognized the unmistakable signal that the bomber had entered effective targeting range. He tightened his grip on the control column, aligning his aircraft precisely with the narrowing corridor ahead as the final moments of the approach began unfolding with the slow, deliberate momentum of something inevitable and irreversible. A confrontation shaped by doctrine, forged by technology, and driven by the quiet resolve of a pilot determined to prove that the night no longer belonged to the enemy. The moment the bomber entered stable radar range, the pilot began tightening his intercept arc with a quiet, practiced precision, angling the F-94 downward just enough to maintain positional advantage without sacrificing the narrow window of visibility that occasionally appeared between the drifting cloud layers. He understood that closing the distance now required a deliberate, almost surgical approach, because one aggressive push of the throttle or a single misjudged bank could easily send him spiraling past the Tu-2's flight path and force a disorganized recovery that would erase the advantage he had spent miles establishing. The darkness demanded discipline, and he responded with the calm patience of someone who knew that precision was far deadlier than speed. As he approached the outer edge of visual acquisition range, the Starfire slipped into another dense pocket of cloud that pressed around the canopy like wet smoke, obscuring everything beyond the faint glow of the instruments. In that moment of sensory deprivation, the pilot relied entirely on the radar's pulsing return, which flickered gently across the scope with the slow, measured cadence of a living heartbeat, guiding him forward through a space that felt more like a void than a sky. The trust he placed in the system was absolute, because he knew the Tu-2 crew below remained unaware of the predator following their every movement, convinced the storm that surrounded them was still their greatest ally. He reduced his airspeed by a precise fraction, allowing the bomber's predicted flight path to intersect perfectly with his own, creating a convergence angle that would place him slightly above and behind the Tu-2, a position that minimized visual detection while maximizing the ability of his radar to maintain a stable lock. The coordination between his hands and the instrument panel became almost instinctive, as if every adjustment was guided by an invisible thread connecting him to the unseen aircraft ahead, pulling him deeper into the heart of the chase with an escalating sense of inevitability. When the Starfire burst through the far edge of the cloud layer, the sudden clarity felt almost shocking, revealing a vast darkness punctuated only by faint starlight shimmering across the ocean far below. For a long heartbeat, the sky appeared completely empty, and the pilot wondered if he had miscalculated the bomber's position. Then, almost imperceptibly, a darker shape emerged at the edge of his vision, a faint silhouette that blended seamlessly with the night until the slight reflection of moonlight along a wingtip revealed it as the unmistakable form of the Tu-2 slicing through the air ahead. Instinct told him to close the distance quickly, but training reminded him that patience would determine whether the intercept succeeded or dissolved into chaos. So he held his position for several seconds, allowing the bomber to settle into a predictable rhythm. He studied the enemy's movement carefully, noting how the aircraft rocked gently with each gust of crosswind, betraying the crew's attempt to maintain a low, steady path toward the coastline, while avoiding any sudden changes that might draw attention from scattered American patrols along the front. Gradually, he nudged the throttle forward, inching closer until the bomber filled a larger portion of his canopy, its engines emitting a faint rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the still air like a distant mechanical pulse. The pilot recognized the vulnerability inherent in this moment, because the Tu-2 remained unaware of his presence, flying with the relaxed confidence of a crew conditioned to believe no danger existed behind them during a night raid. This ignorance, however, made the approach even more delicate, because closing the final gap required absolute silence and perfect control to avoid alerting the enemy before the engagement sequence was ready. As he reached effective weapons distance, the radar return sharpened into a solid, nearly perfect trace, confirming that the Starfire had achieved an ideal intercept position. The pilot steadied his breathing, locked his eyes onto the silhouette ahead, and began preparing the steps that would transform the silent pursuit into a decisive strike. Each movement deliberate, each gesture anchored in the awareness that the next few seconds would decide not only the fate of the Chinese bomber, but the truth behind the Soviet certainty that had shaped months of mistaken doctrine. The moment the Starfire settled into perfect firing range, the pilot felt a calm focus wash over him, sharpening every sense as he aligned his aircraft with the shadowed form drifting steadily ahead through the moonlit haze. He eased the nose downward by a fraction of a degree, allowing the bomber to fill just enough of his sightline to confirm its profile without risking a premature reveal that could startle the crew into an evasive maneuver they were still fully capable of executing. The radar's pulsing return grew brighter and tighter, indicating that the Tu-2 had entered the optimal window for weapons release, and he allowed himself a single steady breath before committing to the sequence that would decide the encounter. With practiced precision, he armed the Starfire's guns, feeling the faint mechanical vibration as the fire control system synchronized itself with the targeting data streaming from the APG-33 radar. Every movement felt amplified against the surrounding silence, as if the night itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the strike. The Tu-2 remained unaware, maintaining its tranquil rhythm across the sky, the engines humming with the steady confidence of a crew convinced no American fighter could possibly be stalking them through the layered darkness above the Pacific. In that misplaced certainty lay the vulnerability he needed, a brief moment where doctrine collided with reality in a way neither the bomber's designers nor its Soviet advisors had ever imagined. He nudged the throttle forward, closing the remaining distance with the steady patience required to prevent wake turbulence from betraying his position, allowing the Starfire to ride the edge of invisibility until the targeting reticle stabilized directly over the bomber's left engine nacelle. The illuminated outline within his gun sight flickered once as a passing cloud refracted the moonlight, but the radar lock remained unbroken, anchoring the Starfire to the Tu-2 with an invisible grip that held fast, despite the shifting winds. The pilot knew he now commanded a position no Chinese crew had ever anticipated, and a quiet, almost reverent focus settled across his thoughts as his finger tightened slowly against the trigger. When he fired, the guns erupted with a sudden burst of controlled fury, sending a stream of .50 caliber rounds slicing through the cold night air with a mechanical rhythm that shattered the stillness. The tracers carved a luminous arc toward the bomber, stitching a precise line across the left wing where fuel, metal, and airflow collided into a shock of sparks that flared brilliantly before vanishing into the darkness. For an instant, the Tu-2 continued forward, as if unaware it had been struck, the engines maintaining their steady pulse, while the fuselage absorbed the initial impact without obvious disruption. Then the damage revealed itself in a violent bloom of flame that erupted near the wing root, illuminating the sky with a sudden orange flash as fuel ignited, and structural integrity failed in a cascading chain of destruction. The bomber lurched sharply to one side, the silhouette twisting unevenly as the crew struggled to regain control. But the wound was fatal, and the Tu-2 began to break apart with a horrifying inevitability. Large fragments trailed behind like burning meteors, scattering debris across the night, while the main fuselage rolled downward in a spiraling descent that left a molten trail shimmering across the clouds. The pilot held position for several seconds, maintaining visual confirmation as the wreckage tumbled toward the ocean, each rotation revealing more flames licking along the collapsing airframe until the final pieces vanished into the void below. Only when the radar return dissolved completely did he release the breath he had been holding, acknowledging the magnitude of what had just occurred. The night that had once protected the Tu-2 had turned against it, and the doctrine that promised invulnerability had failed in the face of a single interceptor, wielding technology capable of piercing the darkness with unprecedented precision. As the Starfire banked gently away from the drifting smoke, the pilot sent a brief transmission to the operations center, confirming the kill with a calm solemnity that carried the weight of the moment. The skies no longer belonged to the bomber crews who once trusted them blindly, and the long-standing assumptions held by Soviet analysts had just been shattered in the span of a few silent, devastating seconds. When the kill confirmation reached the operations center, the message traveled through multiple intelligence nodes before finally arriving at the Soviet liaison offices embedded within the Chinese command network, where a young officer transcribed the report with a growing sense of disbelief spreading slowly across his face. He reread the coded transmission twice, convinced he had misinterpreted some critical detail, because the idea that a Tu-2 had been intercepted and destroyed mid-mission contradicted every assumption they had relied on since the beginning of the night raid campaign. His hesitation drew the attention of a senior advisor nearby, who approached with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, demanding to know why a routine update had suddenly created such visible tension. When the advisor read the decrypted message, his expression shifted from irritation to stunned silence, as the words seemed to undercut the confidence he had carried for months while training Chinese crews to exploit the very darkness that now appeared to have betrayed them. He checked the radar logs, revisited the last known position of the bomber, and evaluated every plausible explanation for the loss, searching desperately for a mechanical failure or navigational error that could justify the event without challenging the doctrinal foundation he had helped reinforce. Yet nothing in the records supported such a comforting conclusion, and he found himself grappling with the uncomfortable reality that an American interceptor had succeeded where Soviet analysts insisted success was impossible. By the time the information reached Moscow, it moved through halls that had grown accustomed to hearing reports of failures from American night defenses, creating an atmosphere where the notion of a successful interception felt more like a rumor than a concrete fact. The GRU officers receiving the initial summary exchanged uncertain glances as they attempted to reconcile the loss with the assessments they had prepared only weeks earlier. Assessments that repeatedly dismissed the F-94 as an unproven experiment lacking the operational maturity required for real combat. Their shock deepened when they realized the bomber had been destroyed not by blind luck or poor navigation, but by a deliberate pursuit carried out entirely within the darkness the Soviets claimed the Americans could not master. Inside the same smoke-filled briefing room where confident laughter once echoed, the mood shifted into something far heavier, as senior analysts reviewed the preliminary reconstruction of the engagement with growing unease. They traced the bomber's path across a wall map, marking the point where it had first been detected, and the corridor where the American interceptor had closed the distance with a precision previously dismissed as beyond U.S. capability. The realization that American airborne radar had achieved a stable lock on a low-flying target shocked even the most seasoned officers, many of whom had confidently argued that such technology remained years away from practical implementation. One colonel, who had mocked the idea of American night interception only days earlier, stared at the reported engagement sequence with a rigid tension tightening his jaw, because he understood more clearly than most that this single event threatened to unravel an entire branch of Soviet analysis. He muttered that perhaps the Americans had acquired some unexpected breakthrough, though the uncertainty in his voice revealed a deeper concern that the Soviets had underestimated an adversary willing to push experimental technology into combat long before traditional doctrine would normally allow it. The fragility of their assumptions became unmistakable as officers realized the Tu-2 had been downed before even reaching its attack corridor, meaning the interceptor had defeated the bomber at the very stage where it was supposed to be most invulnerable. What unsettled them most was not the loss of a single aircraft, but the implications for future operations, because if the Americans could replicate this performance even once more, the entire foundation of low-level night raid strategy risked collapse. The Soviet officers sat in uneasy silence, aware that the shockwave from this single engagement was already expanding outward across every layer of their planning, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the darkness they trusted so completely might no longer belong to them after all. As Soviet analysts continued dissecting the engagement, they gradually realized that the implications extended far beyond the loss of a single bomber, because the kill exposed a structural flaw in the very assumptions that had guided their evaluation of American night capabilities since the beginning of the conflict. They had believed for months that low-level terrain masking provided an impenetrable shield against airborne detection, yet the radar lock achieved by the F-94 demonstrated that the Americans had quietly developed an adaptive system capable of filtering through atmospheric interference with a sophistication previously dismissed as theoretical. This revelation began to unsettle even the most confident officers, who now recognized that their understanding of American radar technology had been shaped more by outdated wartime impressions than by current intelligence. One senior colonel, who had previously boasted that the Tu-2 could not be intercepted under any realistic conditions, found himself re-examining the assumptions embedded within Soviet doctrine, particularly the belief that ground-based radar limitations inherently applied to airborne systems. He acknowledged reluctantly that the United States might have exploited a technological divergence the Soviets had overlooked, deploying a radar suite designed specifically to counter the type of low-level ingress that Chinese crews relied upon so heavily. His admission, though quiet, carried significant weight within the room, because it signaled a departure from the rigid confidence that had previously defined their strategic posture. As the analysts debated the details, a growing sense of vulnerability permeated their discussions, fueled by the realization that the Americans had not simply matched their expectations, but had surpassed them in a domain where Soviet planners had long claimed superiority. They reviewed technical diagrams of the Tu-2's radar signature and flight profile, discovering that several design features, once believed to hinder detection, might actually have produced predictable patterns that a sophisticated airborne radar could exploit. This possibility challenged their earlier conviction that the bomber's construction inherently protected it from modern sensors, exposing the uncomfortable truth that the same traits which once reduced detection during the Second World War no longer offered the same advantages in a rapidly advancing technological landscape. The more the analysts studied the engagement, the more they recognized that the Americans had paired new equipment with a tactical flexibility the Soviets had underestimated, instructing their pilots to operate independently from ground controllers, in ways that allowed them to adapt instantly to subtle shifts within the radar picture. This contrasted sharply with Soviet doctrine, which relied heavily on centralized direction and emphasized rigid execution over improvisation, creating a system where pilots were often constrained by procedural expectations that limited their freedom to exploit unexpected opportunities. The success of the F-94 hinted that American commanders were willing to grant pilots broader operational autonomy, enabling them to leverage new technologies in ways that maximize their effectiveness under the unpredictable conditions of night combat. What troubled the Soviet officers most deeply was the realization that their analytical model had failed, not because of a single oversight, but because it had been built upon layers of assumptions that had never been meaningfully challenged. They had underestimated American radar development, underestimated the adaptability of U.S. pilots, and overestimated the protective value of low-altitude ingress, creating a doctrinal blind spot that now stood exposed before them with painful clarity. In the aftermath of the bomber's destruction, they understood that their predictive models, threat assessments, and training doctrines would all require fundamental revision if they hoped to prevent